Java tutorial for complete beginners. You're going to need two things to get started. They're both free and really quick to install. You're going to need Java Development Kit, JDK. I'll leave the link for that in the description. And the second thing you're going to need is a program for writing code in. I'm using Eclipse. I'll leave the link to go download it in the description as well. The first thing we're going to do in Eclipse is we're going to hit New, and then we're going to hit Java Project. We're going to name the project Hello World. And you don't need to worry too much about what's selected here. You can pretty much just go with the defaults. You might have this little box selected at the bottom that says create module info.java file. You can unselect that if you want. That's what I'm going to do. And then just hit finish and it'll make a project for us. Here's the project. Inside of the project, we're going to right click it and hit new class. For the name, we're going to go Hello World. And I'm going to check off public static void main. And then just hit finish. And we can get rid of this auto-generated method stub. We don't need that. So here we have a class called Hello World, which is everything from this opening curly brace to this ending curly brace. Everything in here is the class. Inside the class, we have a method. This is the main method. Every time a Java program starts up, it's going to start execution inside of the main method. So it's going to start executing the code that's written inside of here. Right now, we're going to write system.out.println. And pay attention to the capitals here. We have a capital on the S, and then everything else is lowercase. Java is case sensitive, so it's not going to do what we want. If we say have a capital P right here, then it's not going to do what we want. I'll leave it in there right now on mine just to show that it's not going to work. We're going to get a set of brackets, and inside the brackets we'll put some double quotes, and we're just going to write Hello World. And at the end of the line we have a semicolon. A semicolon in Java just finishes off a statement. So this is the statement right here, ending with the semicolon. And we're going to run this program now. If you're in Eclipse, then it's just going to be this little green circle up here. So I'll hit that. And I just installed Eclipse on here, so it's asking me if I always want to save the resources before running. I'm going to hit yes, okay. And it's saying that errors exist in the project because of this capital P that I put in right there. So I'll click proceed and just see what happens. And it's giving me this error message here. And Eclipse is super convenient in that it's also showing me this little error flag right here, this little red X, which is showing where the error is, and it's underlining println just to tell me where the error is. So I'm going to change that to a lowercase p. And we'll run this again, and it's just going to write Hello World to the screen. There we go, Hello World. And you don't need to worry about what this means in here for right now. All we need to know is that when we hit system.out.println, then it's going to print out whatever is in the brackets and the quotations in here, and it's going to print it to the console right here. So right now, when we hit start and run the program, then the execution starting in the main method where it finds this print statement, which is what we call this, a print statement. Generally, we wouldn't have code like this inside of a main method. It's best practice to keep your main method looking really clean. If you have a program where you have a ton of print statements in the main method and a ton of other low-level code like that, then it just starts to be really messy and hard to follow along with the logic of the program. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take this print statement and put it inside of its own method. Right now it's inside of this main method right here. We're going to write a second method. We're going to write public static void say hello world. So we've made a method right here that is called say hello world. We won't get too into what these things mean right now. The public just means that it's accessible. Static is kind of confusing to explain for right now. We won't worry about that. And the void just means that this method isn't returning anything. So the method's just going to do something instead of returning a value. For now, we're just going to take this code that we had in the main method. We're just going to cut and paste it into this method, say hello world. And you might think that this would run okay now, that we would hit run up here and then this method would run and it would print hello world. But the execution starts in the main method and there's nothing in the main method right now. So this code isn't even going to run at all. What we need to do to get this code to run is call it from inside of the main method. So to call this method, we just write out its name, say hello world, and we put the brackets, and then we put a semicolon to make it a statement. And we'll hit run, and it's going to put hello world here again. So the program execution is starting in the main method right here. And in the main method, we're saying call the function hello world. So then the program execution jumps to say hello world, and it executes whatever is inside of say hello world, which is the print statement hello world. And then once that's finished, there's nothing else in the main method, so the program is done. It's terminated, it's finished, it's not going to do anything else. And you'll notice that the methods have these brackets right after them. These are for if we want to pass anything to a method. Right now, let's rename this method. We'll say hello to, and then we're going to pass something to this method down here. Inside of double quotes, we'll say Mike. So this says execute the function say hello to and pass it the value of Mike. And now we need to let the method know that it's going to be passed a value. So we need to give it a heads up. We're going to say right here, string person. So this is telling this method say hello to that it's going to be expecting a string, and just to name that string person once it gets passed to it. So right here, it's going to say hello to Mike. So it'll pass Mike to say hello to. So Mike is the string. A string in Java is just a sequence of characters that you're going to see enclosed in double quotations. So Mike is a string right here, just a sequence of characters. And inside of this method, that string of characters is going to be referred to as the person. So inside of our print statement, we'll get rid of the world and we'll say hello. Outside of the quotations, we'll put a plus, and then we're going to write person. So now it'll say hello Mike, because Mike is the person that was passed to this method. Hit run and we get hello Mike. And one of the beautiful things about methods is that we can reuse the code that's in here and we don't have to write it out again every time that we want to use it. Just to show what I mean, let's write a few more print statements in here. It can be anything you want. All right, system.out.println, hey person. And another one, all right, system.out.println, your name is person. So now we can execute these three statements in here just by writing say hello to and then passing it a name. We'll say hello to Karen. So to say hello to Karen, we don't have to write out these three statements again. We've already written them out. And to access them, all we have to do is call the method say hello to. And now when we hit run, it's going to write 6 lines out for us. Hello Mike, hey Mike, your name is Mike, and then the same for Karen in here. Just going to make a new project. We'll call it variables. and a new class inside of that project. Variables, public static void main. Get rid of the auto-generated method stub. We're going to start out with making a variable right away, just so we have an example to look at. We're going to make it a string variable, and we'll name it myString. And what we've just done is called declaring a variable, which essentially just means making the variable. To declare a variable, we indicate the type of variable we want. So here we wanted a variable of type string, and then we give it an identifier, which is just another way of saying the name for it. So the name of this variable is myString. And a variable essentially is just something that we hold a value inside of. So we're going to put a value inside of myString. I'll just write, this is the text in my string. What we've just done here is called initializing the variable, which is just putting a value inside of it. So we've made a variable called myString that is a string variable, and we've assigned it a value on this line of, this is the text in my string. Strings are a really common type of variable in Java. They're essentially just variables that hold a sequence of characters inside of them, or just one character, but usually a sequence of characters. And up here where we declared the variable and then initialized it, oftentimes we'll do that just in one line. So we'll say string myString equals, this is the text in my string. And it's giving me an error here now because I have two variables declared that both have the same name, which we cannot do. So I'll just get rid of this top one. Now, if we wanted to print myString to the screen, all we would have to say is system.out.println myString. Now, if we run this, then it's going to print, this is the text in my string to the console. So that is how to declare and initialize variables in a nutshell. Now we're going to look at some of the different types of variables. Specifically, we're going to look at the 8 types of primitive variables in Java. You don't need to memorize them all right away, but it's good to be familiar with them and know the types of data that they can hold. There are a few that you definitely need to know when you're starting Java, like strings and a couple of the other ones that we're going to look at. But for the most part, when you start out, just being familiar with them is enough. So we looked at a string. Next, we're going to look at a char. To make a char, we'll just follow the same pattern we used for a string. We'll say char my char equals. And this time, instead of double quotations like we used in the string, instead for chars, we use single quotations. And inside of a char, we can hold one character. Make that character a letter or a number or a special character like an exclamation mark. Now if we say system.out.println my char, then it's just going to print the exclamation mark to the screen. So we have, this is the text in my string, that's from this print statement here, and then we have the exclamation mark here printed from system.out.println my char. And next we'll make a byte. So we'll go byte, my byte equals 127. So bytes hold whole numbers anywhere from -128 to 127. To be honest, you're not going to use bytes a whole lot. It's just good to be familiar with them. Same with shorts. A short is similar to a byte, just it has a slightly bigger range, and so it takes up a little bit more space in storage. It can hold numbers anywhere from -32,768 to 32,767. And then we have ints, which you do use all the time in Java. We'll say int my int equals 2,147,483,647, which is the maximum value that an int can hold. If we want to store a value larger than that, then we're going to need a long. We'll say long my long. The maximum value we can store in a long is 9,872,372,854,775,807. And to let Java know that it's a long, we need to include an L after it. Usually we'll use the capital L just to stop it from getting confused with a 1. And with all of these variables here, we can't store decimal values. We have some specific variable types for storing decimal values. We have floats, which store about 6 or 7 decimal digits. And to let Java know that it's a float, we need to include an F after. It can be lowercase or uppercase, up to you. Otherwise, we'll get an error because Java tries reading it as a double and gets confused. Double is the next type we're going to look at. A double is similar to a float, just it can hold more decimals after it. We can do up to 15 decimals. And we only have one type left, and that's going to be Boolean, which is another type that we will use all the time in Java. The only two possible values for Boolean are true or false. So we have Boolean, my Boolean equals true, or we could have my Boolean equals false. And we can change the value of variables like we did right here. Originally my Boolean was true, but here we changed it to false. Likewise, we could take, say, my int and change its value to 26. And now if we print the value of my int, it's going to be 26 instead of the 2 billion that we had up here. If we save and run this, we have 26 here. There's a lot to take in when you're starting Java. When you're getting started out, you can probably get by just by knowing booleans, doubles, ints, and strings. Now we'll take a super quick look at the scope of variables. The scope just refers to where in the program a variable can be accessed from. We haven't gone over if statements in this series yet, but I'm going to use one right now just to show what the scope of a variable is. I'm going to say if my int is greater than 0, then make a new variable of type Boolean called greater than 0 and assign it a value of true. So what's going to happen here is if the variable my int is greater than 0, then a new variable is going to be created called greater than 0 that is equal to true because the number will be greater than 0. When we talk about the scope of a variable, it just means that the variable only exists in the area that it was created in. So this Boolean variable greater than 0 right now only exists inside of this if statement. So inside of this if statement, we could say system.out.println greater than 0, and it's just going to print the value of greater than 0 for us. And the value of greater than 0 right now is true. But if we took this print statement and we put it outside of the if statement, then we're going to get an error because greater than 0 does not exist anymore. It only exists inside of this if statement here. What we could do if we want to be able to print it outside of this if statement is just declare and initialize it up here. Boolean greater than 0 equals false. And then if the number is greater than 0, then the value of greater than 0 can just get changed inside of the if statement. And then we can still access greater than 0 outside of the if statement because it was declared. inside of the main method. And so anything inside of the main method now has access to greater than 0. So the purpose of a for loop is to execute the same code multiple times without having to write out the code multiple times. So we can just write it out once instead of having to waste time writing out the same code over and over. So to start writing our for loop, we just write the word for, and then we put some brackets. In the brackets, we're going to put 3 things. First, we're going to make an integer I, which we'll set to 0. I is going to be our counter for the for loop, essentially. And the for loop is going to keep going as long as I is less than 1,000. And after each pass of the for loop, we want I to increase by 1. So we're just going to write I plus plus. Plus plus just means increase by 1. So increase I by 1 after every pass of the for loop. And then we're going to make a set of curly braces, and everything in between the braces is going to execute for each pass of the for loop. Inside the for loop, we'll just put a print statement, and we'll just have it print the value of I. So we've declared a variable I of type int and set it to 0 to start. And we've said that we want the for loop to keep going as long as I is less than 1,000. So as soon as I is 1,000, then the loop's going to stop. And after each pass of the loop, we're just getting I to increase by 1. And for each pass of the loop, everything inside the braces is going to execute. So I is just going to be printed to the screen. So if we save and run this, we're going to get everything from 0 to 999 printed to the console. And we can change any of the values in here if we want to. So we could start I at 5 and have it keep going until I is less than 10. And we could have I increase by 2 after each pass of the loop. There is a quicker way to write this than what we're going to do, but we haven't covered unary operators yet in this series, so we're just going to write I equals I plus 2. So I is going to start at 5, the loop's going to keep going as long as I is less than 10, and I is going to increase by 2 after each pass of the loop. So we're going to get 5, 7, and 9 printed to the screen. We could also use values in here that aren't numbers. So we could say as long as I is less than num dogs, and then we have to declare and initialize num dogs up here. So we'll say int number of dogs equals 11. And then we can make another variable to use in the for loop. Let's say int number of dogs fed. And we'll set number of dogs fed equal to 0 at the start of the loop. So 0 dogs have been fed, and as long as the number of dogs that have been fed is less than the total number of dogs, then increase the number of dogs that have been fed by 1, so plus plus. And then for each pass, we're going to print out num dogs fed plus space dogs have been fed. And then on the next line, we'll make another print statement. We'll say num dogs minus num dogs fed. And we'll put that in an extra set of brackets just to make it clear what's happening. So we'll say num dogs minus num dogs fed plus still need to be fed. So we have the number of dogs fed, which starts at 0. The loop's going to keep going until all of the dogs have been fed. Let's just make this less than or equal to num dogs so that in the end it prints out 0 dogs still need to be fed. And for each pass of the loop, 1 more dog is going to be fed. And our print statements in here are just going to get printed to the console for each pass. So in the beginning, we have 0 dogs which have been fed and 11 which need to be fed, and then it just keeps counting up until all 11 dogs have been fed. Let's start out with 2 variables to test inside of our if statements. I'll say int num meals equals 100, int num people equals 100. So we have 100 people and 100 meals. Now we'll write out our if statements. Let's put if, and then a set of brackets. Inside the brackets is going to be our condition. So we can put any condition in here that will evaluate to true or false. So let's put if num meals is equal to num people. Double equals in Java just compares for equality. So this is going to check if the number of meals is equal to the number of people. And if it is, then the code inside of these 2 curly braces is going to execute. So we'll put system.out.println. There is exactly the right amount of food. So if we run this right now, then we'll just get there is exactly the right amount of food. Now let's put a else if statement onto here. We're going to say else if, and then we're going to put a condition for our else if statement. Let's say else if num meals is less than num people, then system.out.println there is not enough food. And this else if statement is only going to be evaluated, this else if condition is only going to be evaluated if the condition above it in the if statement evaluates to false. Execution continuing. So if we wanted to make sure this second else if condition is always looked at, then we wouldn't use an else if statement here. We could just write another if statement down here. So right now this else if statement is only looked at if the number of meals is not equal to the number of people. So let's put number of meals is 80. So now we're going to get there is not enough food. Execution continuing. So as soon as any one of these statements evaluates to true, then the execution continues down to here without looking at the rest of the conditions. We could put another else if statement in here if we wanted to. Let's put an example of something that we wouldn't usually put in here, something that's not a good idea to put in. Let's put else if num people equals 200. And print out there are exactly 200 people. So if we wanted this to always print out when there are 200 people, then we wouldn't put it in this else if statement here, because we could have the kind of situation where we have, say, 80 meals and 200 people. And it's not going to print out there are exactly 200 people because this very first expression is going to evaluate to true. Sorry, not the first one. The first one is for equality. The second one right here, num meals is less than num people, is going to evaluate to true. And as soon as that evaluates to true, then this code is going to execute in here. And then it's going to jump right past this second else if statement. It's not even going to look at it. So even though there are 200 people, it's not going to print out there are 200 people because one of the statements above it evaluates to true. So we just get there's not enough food and then execution continuing down here. Now let's put an else statement in here. An else statement doesn't get a condition. It just executes the code inside of it if every single condition above it evaluates to false. So if all 3 conditions up here evaluate to false, then the code in the else is going to execute. So in our case, if it executed, then we would get there is too much food because we know there's not exactly the right amount of food, and there's not too little food, so there's too much, and there's not exactly 200 people, so there's too much food and not exactly 200 people. So let's change this up here so that our else statement will execute. Let's make 201 people and 800 meals. So now we're going to get our else statement executing. There is too much food and not exactly 200 people. And I should note, for anyone who's never written else if blocks before, that none of this is possible without the first if statements. So we couldn't just have else if and else statements. That doesn't work. We need the original if statement in here. Otherwise, the rest of it won't work. The else if statements are optional. We could leave those out and this code would still work fine. We would just have the if statements, and if the if statement wasn't true, then the else statement would execute. And the else statement is also optional. We could leave it off. We could just have if and then some else ifs and then continue with our code down here. I'm just going to make a new Java project called arrays, and I'll make a new class in that project called arrays. An array is a variable that holds multiple values in it. It's sort of like a list of variables. We'll start off with an example. We'll say int array. Making these square brackets makes this an array. So we say int array my int array equals new int array. And inside of these square brackets here, we're going to put how many elements we want in the array. So that'll be how many values we want to hold in this array. So we're going to put 5 values inside of it. So right now we have an integer array with 5 elements in it. An element is just a value in the array. Now we're going to put a value into the first element in the array. So we'll say my int array 0. So that'll be the 0th element. Sometimes we call it the first element. Sometimes we call it the 0th element. Essentially, arrays just start counting at 0 instead of counting at 1. So the 5 elements that we have right now are numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So into the 0th element, we're going to put a value of 1000. And into the next element, we're going to put a value of 1500. So this int array is just like a list of integer values. And we'll populate the other 3 values in here. Element 3 will go 500. You can put whatever you want in here. It doesn't really matter. We're just filling up the array with values. So now we have an integer array that has been populated with these 5 values here. And now let's print one of these values to the screen. We'll print the last element in the array, which is my int array 4. So it's going to print 550 to the console. Next, we'll look at a different way to make this array that can be a little bit quicker sometimes. It's called using an array literal, which is just a fancy way of describing how we're going to make this array. So it's int array my int array equals, and then we're going to get rid of all this over here. And we're just going to put a set of curly braces and a semicolon. And inside of the curly braces, we're going to put the elements in the array. More specifically, the values that we want in the elements in the array. So we'll say my int array equals 1000, 1500, 27, 32, and 87. So now we have an int array called my int array, which has 5 elements in it, numbered 0 to 4. And these are the values that are inside each of those elements. So we can print out the value that's held in my int array 0. And we're going to get 1000 printed to the screen. Next, we'll make a string array. So we'll write string array my plants, and this array will hold our plants inside of it. And because we're dealing with strings, we have to enclose our values in the quotations. So we'll say element 1 is snake plant. Element 2 is oyster plants. Element 3 is cactus. So now we have a string array called my plants, which has 3 elements. The 0th element is snake plant, and then we have oyster plant and cactus. So if we print my plants, let's print element 1. If we print this to the screen, we're going to get oyster plant. And now let's add a couple more plants onto here. Let's put Ruby Glow Peperomia and Fantasy Venice. So now we have 5 elements in our array, and we're going to do something that you do all the time with arrays, which is using a for loop to cycle through the values in the array. So we're going to say for int I equals 0, and we want the for loop to keep going as long as I is less than the length of my plants. And to get the length of my plants, all we have to do is type the name of the array dot length, and that'll give us the length of it. And then we'll just say I plus plus so that I increments by 1 for each pass. And then we're just going to print out the value of each element in the array. So we'll say my plants, and then in the square brackets, we're going to put I. So for each pass of the loop, my plants I is going to be printed to the screen. So on the first pass, I is 0. So the 0th element in my plants will be printed to the screen, which is snake plant. And then on the next pass, I is going to increment by 1. So I will be 1. And then oyster plant is going to be printed to the screen, and then it'll cycle through the whole array. So we're going to get all 5 values printed to the console here. And we still have this print statement up here, so we actually got 6 values printed. If we get rid of that, then we'll just have our for loop printing all of the values in the array. I'm going to make a new Java project, call it Scanner Tutorial, and a new class inside that project called Scanner Tutorial. And the first thing we're going to do is import the scanner class. So at the very top of our program, above the class Scanner Tutorial, at the very top, we're going to write import java.util.scanner, and note the capital S on the scanner. So this imports the scanner class into our program. Without this statement, our program can't use a scanner. And next we're going to make a scanner. So we're going to say scanner scnr equals new scanner, and then in brackets we're going to write system.in. So scnr is the name of our new scanner that we've just made, and with scnr we can do lots of awesome stuff. To get an example of what the scanner can do, we're just going to ask the user a question. We'll say system.out.println, how many dogs do you have? And then on the next line, we're going to store the number of dogs that the user has inside of an integer. So we'll say int num dogs equals scnr dot next int. And then let's just print out you have plus num dogs plus dogs. And we'll save and run this. So we have, how many dogs do you have? And I'll type 9 and then hit enter. And then it says you have 9 dogs. And let's run our program again, because we're going to intentionally crash it this time. We're going to see what happens if we answer with something that isn't an integer. So if we say, I have 9 dogs, then our program is going to crash because this is a string right here. So the scnr next int method is going to come looking for an integer, and it's expecting this answer to be an integer, but this is a string. And so as soon as we hit enter right here, the program's going to crash. In the next tutorial, we're going to look at validating user input to make sure that the user can only enter an integer here. I'll link to that video in the description, but for now we're just going to leave our program as it is because that's a whole nother topic. Next, we're going to use a different scanner method called nextLine. And we're going to do it above this code that we have right here, and we'll see why after. So we'll do it under where we've declared the scanner, but above this code down here. We'll just write system.out.println, type a sentence and hit enter. And then on the next line, we'll write string user string. So we've just made a string that is named user string, and then inside of that string we're going to store what is returned by the method scnr nextLine. So the nextLine method is going to take the whole line that the user types in up to and including the enter key character, which might seem kind of irrelevant right now, but it's going to be relevant in a sec once we switch up our code. And I'll just write a print statement in here to print out the user string. We'll say you typed plus the string. Type a sentence and hit enter. You typed I like plants, and then it asks us how many dogs do you have. I'll say 9 dogs. You have 9 dogs. Next, we're going to switch up the order of these two questions. So we're going to put how many dogs do you have above, type a sentence and hit enter. I'll just cut and paste these 3 lines and put them down beneath here. And now we're going to run this code. We get how many dogs do you have? 9. And then I hit enter, and then the rest of this prints out. It says type a sentence and hit enter. I didn't even type anything, but now it says you typed. To understand what's happening here, we need to take a quick look at what actually happens when we call nextInt and nextLine. So the input that the user types in is stored in something called the buffer. So when the user types in a sentence, I like plants, then I like plants is stored in the buffer. And when the user hits the enter key, then the enter key is in the buffer. When we call the method nextLine, then this entire line is taken from the buffer and stored into the user string, including the enter character. But when we call nextInt, so if the user types 9 and then hits enter, the nextInt method works differently than the nextLine method. The nextLine grabs the entire line, including the enter character, but the nextInt only grabs the nextInt. It doesn't grab the enter character from the buffer. So we asked, how many dogs do you have? And then the user typed 9 and then hit enter. So then nextInt came in and took the 9, but that leaves us with the enter character still left in the buffer. So the program says type a sentence and hit enter, but the enter character is still left in the buffer. So the program thinks that the user has hit enter right away. So it grabs the next line, which is not anything printable. It's just the enter character, and then it moves on in the program. So anytime we use the methods nextInt, nextDouble, or next, then if we want to use nextLine after them, we need to do something called flushing the buffer. If we're using nextInt and then nextInt right away, then we're not going to need to flush the buffer. What happens if we use nextInt twice in a row is, say the user types in 9 and then hits enter, then nextInt comes in and grabs the next int that's in there. And then if we called the next int method again right after, then it comes in here and it sees, okay, there's just an enter character in here. There is no integer for me to grab, so let's wait for some user input. Whereas next line works differently in that it comes in here and it sees, oh, there's an enter character to grab. That's a line. Let's grab the enter character. So anytime we use one of these methods and we want to call next line next, then we have to flush the buffer. So let's do that right now. Let's get rid of this second next int. And we're just going to write scnr.nextLine. And notice we're not even storing this in a variable because we don't want it. There's nothing we can do with this. When we call next line, then it's just going to come in and it's going to grab the enter character. So then the buffer is going to be empty. So then when we call next line down here, then there's an empty buffer. And so the program's going to wait for some user input so that it can grab the next line. So now if we run this, it's going to work okay and it's going to wait for us. How many dogs do you have? 9. Type a sentence and hit enter. So it's working now because we flushed that extra enter character out of the buffer when we used the next line. Next, we'll quickly look at the next double and next methods. They're both pretty straightforward. We'll say enter a decimal number. And then we'll say double my double equals scnr.next double, and then we'll print out my double. And while we're at it, we'll show how the next method works. We'll say system.out.print, and this time let's say enter another sentence so that we can see how the next method works. We'll say string user word equals scnr.next. The next method is just going to grab the next sequence of characters from the buffer up to the next space. So if we type in a sentence, it's just going to grab the first word of the sentence, and then it's going to store that in user word. And then if we called it again right after, then it's just going to store the next word in the sentence into user word 2. So it grabs the next sequence of characters from the buffer and leaves everything else in the buffer after that sequence of characters in the space. And then let's print out the user words. I'll say system.out.print user word plus a space plus user word 2. Let's save and run this. How many dogs do you have? 9. Type a sentence. Enter a decimal number. Enter another sentence. So we called scanner next twice. The first time took the I, and the second time we called it took the word also. And then we printed out word 1 plus space plus word 2. There's one more scanner method I want to look at. We haven't covered while loops in these tutorials yet, but I'm going to use one right now just to show how this last method works. I'm going to say while scnr.hasNext. HasNext is a method that checks if there's still another token in the input. A token is just the sequence of characters up to the space that we talked about. So it's going to check if there's another complete token in the input and return either true or false. True if there is a token and false if there is not. And as long as there is another token in the input, then let's store that token in a string called word. So we'll say scnr.next, and that will grab the word and store it in word, and then we're going to print out the word. So this while loop is going to keep executing as long as there is another word in the input. So hasNext will keep returning a value of true as long as there is another token in the input, and then we'll grab that token and we'll print it out to the console. So up here we have enter another sentence. The user will enter a sentence. The first word will be taken from it. The second word will be taken from it. Those two words will be printed to the console. And as long as there are any more words still left in the input, then they're going to be printed to the console. So let's run this right now and see what happens. How many dogs do you have? 9, type of sentence and hit enter. I like plants, enter a decimal number. And this time I won't enter a decimal number. I'm just going to type 90. And Java's just going to take this and turn it into a decimal number so that it can store it in the double. And then we'll enter another sentence. I like plants and I also like dogs. Hit enter. And there's our first 2 words that got grabbed from the first 2 times we called the next method. So it prints those out, and then we have this while loop. So as long as the input still has another word in it, then that word gets stored in the string word and printed to the screen. So all the rest of the words that are left in the input get printed to the screen until hasNext returns false, because there's nothing left in the input. And if we wanted all of these words on the same line, then we could just get rid of the ln here, just say system.out.print, and then we'll add a space before word right here. So we'll say space plus word. The print method is just like println, but it doesn't print it on a new line. And then we'll have to change this one up here to print instead of println as well. And now everything's all going to print out on the same line. How many dogs? 9. I like plants. 90. I like plants and dogs. All on the same line down here. And the hasNext method also exists for integers. So hasNext int. If we have a list of ints, then we could use a while loop with hasNext int, and it also exists for hasNext double and hasNext line. Java tutorial 5, we're looking at how to comment in Java, what a comment is, and why we leave comments. I'll just make a new Java project called comments, and a new class inside of that project also called comments. So what is a comment? A comment is writing in your code that Java isn't going to read as code. So right here, I'm going to write a comment isn't code. When your code is run, the comment is ignored. And you'll notice I put these 2 slashes in here before I wrote this. The 2 slashes are what we use in Java for writing single line comments. So anything on the rest of this line after the 2 slashes is going to be ignored when the code is run. So I could write something up here, and then something down here. And this code will be executed, the comments will not be executed, and this code down here will be executed. I could put another comment right here that says, next I is going to be changed to 9. So int I equals 8 will be executed, and then we have 2 slashes, so the rest of this won't be executed. It's just for us to read. And then this next line also won't be executed because there's 2 slashes making it a comment. And then this line will be executed again. So the comments are just for programmers to see. They're not run as code. And the reason we leave them is so that our code is easier to understand. So if I write this code here and then I go write a bunch of other code and I come back and look at this, then I can just look at the comments and see what's happening. Obviously in this example, the comments are kind of simple. They're not really explaining anything, but when your programs get more complex, then comments become more useful to explain what's happening in your code. They also help other people understand your code. If someone was to come and look at this program, then comments can help them take a look at the program and instantly understand what's happening in the program. These 2 comments right here are both single line comments, and for single line comments we use double slashes. If we want to write a longer comment that's going to be more than 1 line, then we write /* */ and you can see Eclipse automatically fill this in for me. This star right here isn't totally necessary. Everything in here is still considered a comment as long as there's the /* and the */. Eclipse just kind of puts it in to keep everything looking organized and clean. So here we could write, this is a multi-line comment. It spans over many lines. And then after the comment, we could write some more code, and it is going to be executed system.out.println. We'll just print the value of I to the screen, which is 9 from up here. So we run this and we get 9 printed to the console. So in summary, everything that is not a comment is executed, and everything that is a comment is not executed. The double slashes are for a single line comment, and the /* is for if you want to write a comment that's going to be more than one line. There's a few ways to loop in Java. One way we can do it is with a while loop. Let's set up an int to use in the while loop. We'll say int x equals 0. And then in the brackets after the keyword while, then we put an expression. It can be any expression that evaluates to true or false. Let's say while x is less than or equal to 10. And then in the following curly brackets here after the expression, then we put the code that's going to execute if the expression evaluates to true. Let's say system.out.println x is plus the value of x. And if we run this right now, we're going to get an infinite loop because x is going to always be less than or equal to 10 because we haven't changed the value of x anywhere. So that's something we want to avoid. Let's run this right now just to see what's going to happen. Our program just keeps printing out x is 0 until we stop it because it's stuck in an infinite loop. So we have to say x plus plus. So increase the value of x by 1 for every time through the loop. Or we could do x plus equals 2 or any number here. So this is just going to increase x by 2 for every pass through the loop. So now if we run this, we're going to get x's 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and then it's going to stop. X is 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So in short, that's what a while loop is. We just have the keyword while, an expression that evaluates to true or false, and then the code that follows in the curly brackets here that will execute every time that this evaluates to true. Now let's have some fun with while loops. Instead of just having an example here where we're just dealing with x, let's do some fun stuff with them. Let's say while not at store. So we're going to make a person and we're going to have them walk to the store. Let's say int orig distance equals 900. We'll say that's in meters, and then we'll say int distance walked equals 0, and then we'll say int distance from store, and first we'll just set this to the orig distance, so that's as far as they are away from the store to start out with, and then we're going to update distance from store inside of our loop. Let's make a boolean at store and set that to false originally because the person is not at the store. And we can get rid of this x up here. We don't need that anymore. Let's say while not at store, distance walked plus equals 50. So they're going to walk 50 meters if they're not at the store yet. Let's put an if statement inside of our while loop. Let's say if distance from store is less than or equal to 0, then at store equals true. Else distance walked plus equals 50. And let's put some print statements in here just to see what's happening. Let's say system.out.println you are at the store. And then system.out.println, you are plus distance from store plus meters from the store. And then we're going to have to update distance from store because right now the program just thinks that it's the same as the orig distance up here. So after distance walked plus equals 50, let's just put distance from store equals orig distance minus distance walked. Let's run this right now and see what happens. So the person starts out 850 meters. Well, they start out 900 meters and then they walk the original 50 meters. And then we get them walking to the store, and then you are 0 meters from the store and you are at the store. And just to see more of what while loops can do, let's put some more stuff in here. Let's say while not at store, and for and we use double ampersand. So while not at store and not too tired. So the double ampersand is going to make it so that it evaluates both of these. So not at store and not too tired. And in order for the code in here to execute, both of these statements have to evaluate to true. If just one of them evaluates to true, then it's not going to execute. Both of these have to be true. They have to be not at the store and not too tired. And of course, we'll need Boolean too tired equals false. And now let's just put another if statement under here. Let's say if distance walked is greater than or equal to 10,000 meters, then too tired is going to equal true, and we'll print out you are too tired, you can't go on. So right now if we run this, the person's going to be fine because they only have 900 meters to walk to the store. It's going to be the same as before. Let's go ahead and change this to 90,000. Let's say they have 90 kilometers to the grocery store. So now we're going to get you are too tired, you can't go on, because one of these evaluated to false, and so the while loop stopped. And let's have some more fun. Let's take all of this and put it into a function first, just because it's kind of messy having it in our main method like this. Let's say walk to store. Actually, no, even better. Let's say get groceries. And then we're going to go down below our main method. And we'll say public static void get groceries. It's okay if you don't understand all these words right here. You can just follow along. Public static void get groceries. And then inside of here we'll say Boolean walk successful equals walk to store. And then we're going to take all of this stuff, and this is going to be our walk to store method. So we'll say from get groceries down to here, we want all of this. Now we're going to define a walk to store method. We're going to say public static Boolean walk to store. Boolean instead of void, because this method is going to return a Boolean value. And that Boolean value is going to be stored inside of walk successful up here. So we have public static Boolean walk to store. And that's where we're going to put all of our code that was up in the main method before. I'm just going to take this get groceries, put it back into the main method, because that's the original method we want to call. So now in our main method, all we have is get groceries, which is beautiful because it doesn't look nice having a lot of messy low-level code in the main method. So we just have get groceries now. So get groceries is going to be called, and then the execution will jump down to here and get groceries, and then it will execute walk to store and store whatever is returned by that into the Boolean walk successful. And then let's say if walk successful. And remember, in if statements and while loops, we can put any expression that will evaluate to true or false, and walk successful is a Boolean, so its only possible values are true or false. So if walk successful essentially just means the same thing as if walk successful equals true. This is just shorter and easier to write and easier to read and understand. So we say if walk successful, then shop in store. And now we have to define shop in store. We have a couple error messages right now, but we'll deal with those as they come up. Right now, we just need to define shop in store. We'll say public static void shop in store. And we had another error message up here because right now we haven't told this method to return the Boolean value. So we need to go down to the bottom of the method and say return walk successful. You can name this one whatever you want. It doesn't necessarily have to match up with the walk successful up here where the value of true or false is being returned into. It can be named anything. Let's say return walk successful, and now we need to define walk successful. Boolean walk successful, and then we'll say if not too tired and at store. So if the person is not too tired and they are at the store, then walk successful equals true. And we can just set it to false originally. So Boolean walk successful equals false. If they're not too tired and they've got to the store, then walk successful equals true. And then the value in walk successful is going to be returned to where we called the method up here, where we called walk to store. So now Boolean walk successful is going to have a value of true or false. And then if that value is true, if the walk was successful, then the person's going to shop in the store. Let's say they have a grocery list to get and they also need broccoli. Let's say while not finished list or, and logical or in Java is just these two lines here. You'll find them on your keyboard right above the enter key. We'll say while not finished list or not has broccoli. And then we'll need to define both of these Booleans. Boolean has broccoli equals false. Boolean finished list equals false. And let's say int num groceries to get equals 10. And whatever we put in this while loop is going to execute as long as one of these statements evaluates to true. So while either the list isn't finished or the person doesn't have broccoli, then they're going to keep shopping inside of this while loop. So for logical and, then both of these statements had to evaluate to true in order for the loop to keep executing. But for logical or, only one statement needs to evaluate to true. So while they're not finished the list or they don't have broccoli, then let's say num groceries to get minus minus, so they get one more grocery every time. And then we'll say if num groceries to get equals 0, then finished list equals true. And now we're going to use math.random to give this person a 1 in 3 chance of getting broccoli. Let's say int random num equals int, and then in brackets, math.random times 3. So they'll have a 1 in 3 chance of getting the broccoli. I'll explain how this math.random works in a second. Let's say if random num equals 0. I guess that's not going to make any sense without explaining how math.random works. So math.random, which we called up here, returns, here, we'll take this out, by itself, math.random returns a random double between 0 and 0.99. So if we call the math.random by itself, then we get a double returned. We could say double num returns equals math random. So it's going to be a random number between 0 and less than 1. I'm pretty sure it's a repeating 0.99999. So we get a random double returned greater than 0 and less than 1. And up here, we put it into an int. But what's returned by math random is a double. So in order to be able to store it in an int, we just write int in brackets. And then Java just takes it and converts it to an int so that it can store it in this random num here. And we put times 3. That's just going to take the random double returned by math random and multiply it by 3. So that would leave us with a number between 0 and 2.9. And the way that Java is going to convert this to an int, remember ints can't hold decimals. So the way that Java is going to convert it to an int is just by chopping off the decimal. It's not going to round it, it's just going to truncate it. It's just going to get rid of all the decimal. So that means that what's going to be returned into int random num is just a number between 0 and 2. Because we could end up with 0.11 or 0 point decimal, whatever, but that would just be cut off. We'd get a 0 because it gets cut off when we convert it to an int. And we could end up with 2.99, again, would get cut off. So in random num, we're going to have either 0, 1, or 2. Those are the only 3 possible values in there. So we have 3 possible values that could be stored in int random num right now. Let's pick one of them. We'll say 0. We'll say if random num is 0. So there's a 1 in 3 chance that it's going to be 0. We'll say if random num equals 0, then has broccoli equals true. And I guess we don't want the person to be able to get broccoli multiple times. So we could put if not has broccoli. That way this code will only execute if the person doesn't have broccoli yet. Let's take this, throw it inside of the if statement. And let's just put a print statement in here, system.out.println, yay, you got broccoli. So let's run this right now and see what we get. The person is too tired, they can't go on because we still haven't changed the value at the very top. Let's change the orig distance back to 900 meters so that the person can make it to the store. So they're at the store and they got broccoli. Let's put some more print statements in here so we can actually see what's going on. Let's say if not has broccoli and not finished list, system.out.println, you need to finish your list and get broccoli. Else if not has broccoli and finished list. So if they don't have broccoli but they have finished your list, system.out.println, if I can type here, system.out.println, you need to get broccoli still. And we're just accounting for all the possibilities here for what they could have and not have. Let's say else if has broccoli but isn't finished the list. System.out.println, you need to finish your list. And finally, we have our else statement, which is the person being done shopping. So they have the broccoli and they're finished the list. That's the only possibility that we haven't accounted for. Let's say system.out.println. You are done shopping. You have broccoli and your list is done. Yay, you're amazing. And up here, let's put another print statement. Let's put it right after num groceries to get. Let's say system.out.println. You got another item. Yay. Now let's run this and then we'll actually be able to see what's happening in here. So the person walks to the store. They are 0 meters from the store. They're at the store. They got an item. That's their first item. So really it shouldn't say you got another item. Let's make that more accurate. You got an item. So they get to the store, they get an item, yay. They got broccoli on their very first item, lucky them. And then they keep finishing their list, getting items. And then in the end, you're done shopping, you have broccoli and your list is done. Yay, you're amazing. We're looking at try catch blocks. Let's start it with a simple example. Let's say try followed by some curly braces, and then catch followed by some brackets, followed by some curly braces. Inside of the catch brackets, we're just going to put exception E, and we're going to put some code inside of the try block that might throw an exception. And if there is an exception, then the catch is going to execute, and the exception is just going to get passed to the catch, and it's going to be named E. I'll make a scanner so that we can use it inside of our try catch block. Import java.util.scanner. Let's make the scanner up here scanner scnr equals new scanner system.in. And let's make an integer to use inside of our try catch block too. Let's say int user int equals -1. And inside of our try block, let's say user int equals scnr dot next int. And there's a lot of different ways that this could throw an exception. If the user enters anything that isn't an integer, then it's going to throw an exception, and then the catch block is going to execute. Let's put system.out.println. That was not a whole number. There's a few other things we could put inside of our catch block. For now, we'll just leave it with this print statement. Let's run this. And let's just put another print statement above this that says system.out.println. Enter a whole number, no decimals. And let's run this and see what we get. We're going to get enter a whole number, no decimals. And let's enter 20.5, so we're entering a decimal number. So then our catch block executes and says that was not a whole number. What the catch block has done is it's stopped the program from crashing. If we did this without the try catch block, I'm just going to comment the try catch block out for now. If we did this without the try catch block, if we said user int equals scnr dot next int, then the program's going to crash if we enter something that's not a whole number. So we try and enter something and the program's done, it's crashed. If we had any code after this, then it wouldn't execute. So we can say system.out.println. This won't execute because the program's going to crash at user int equals scnr next int. So then we don't get this won't execute printed. But with the try catch block, if we take this and put it down beneath the try catch block, now we can say this will execute because the program's not going to crash. So we run it, we get enter whole number, we can put 2.5, and then it says that was not a whole number, this will execute. So the program hasn't crashed since we used a try catch block. And now let's make this even better. Let's put our try catch block inside of a while loop. Let's say while not valid. So as long as a valid number hasn't been entered, then the try catch block is going to keep executing. And we'll have to make a Boolean valid equals false. So until we get valid input, then the try catch is just going to keep executing. And inside of the try, let's put valid equals true. Valid equals true is only going to execute if user int equals scnr next int executes without throwing an exception. If it does throw an exception, then the program execution is just going to jump down to the catch block, so valid equals true won't execute. So valid equals true is only going to execute if we get valid input into user int. So let's run this right now, and it's not going to do what we want it to do. It's going to be caught in a weird kind of loop because we haven't cleared the buffer. So let's run it just to see what happens. We get enter a whole number, and let's put 2.5. And then the while loop's just going to keep executing because the 2.5 is still going to be in the buffer after user int equals scnr next int. Because user int equals next int isn't going to be successful, then 2.5 isn't going to be taken out of the buffer. So the exception is going to get thrown. It'll say that was not a whole number. And then the execution will jump back up to here because we're still in the while loop, and it's just going to keep trying, but it's going to keep trying with the 2.5 still in the buffer. So we're going to have to clear the 2.5 out of the buffer. If we enter it right now, we just get that was not a whole number infinitely printing out. So inside of our catch block, we're just going to say scnr dot next line. So that will clear out the decimal number that we're going to put into the buffer. So we get enter a whole number, no decimals. We enter 2.5, and now we get that was not a whole number. And now we can just try again. And again, that was not a whole number. We can put words in here. And it's still going to keep executing until we enter a whole number, and then the loop's going to be done. And then it's going to print out this will execute or whatever we had after our while loop. Now let's make this even better. Let's have the user guess a number between 1 and 10. Let's say system.out.println guess a number between 1 and 10. No decimals. And let's change Boolean valid into Boolean correct, because now we're looking for a correct answer. So let's say while not correct. And we'll use mathrandom to generate us a random number. Let's say int random num equals int math.random times 10 plus 1. So math.random will generate us a random double between 0 and 0 point repeating 9. That will be multiplied by 10, which gives us something between 0 and 9 point repeating 9. And then we're going to add 1 to that, which will give us a number between 1 and 10 point repeating 9. And then that gets cast as an int, which gives us a whole number between 1 and 10. So inside of our try block, let's say if user int equals random num, then correct equals true. And we'll print out system.out.println that was right. Else we'll say try again. Even better, actually, let's put else if user int is lower than random num, then put that is too low, try again. And then we'll say else that is too high, try again. And we're going to run this right now, and then we'll do something after to make it even better. Let's say, guess a number between 1 and 10, no decimals. So if we try entering right now, say 5.5, then we get that was not a whole number. And then let's try and guess the number now. Let's say 5, and 5 was right away. Let's try this again. Guess a whole number between 1 and 10. 5, that is too low. 8, that was right. Now we're going to go into our catch block, and it's not entirely relevant for our program that we're making right now, but just to display what this method does, we're going to write e.print stack trace. E is the exception, and it's just going to print the stack trace of the exception. So it's going to show where in the program the exception was thrown, where the problem happened. So we get, guess, a number between 1 and 10. We tried 20.5, and then it says that was not a whole number. And then it prints the exception, which is the input mismatch exception. And it tells us where it's happening at. So it's happening at trycatch.main, which is the main method of our class that we're in right now. And it's happening on the 15th line. The 15th line is where we try and store the int into user int, but of course 20.5 isn't an int. And one last thing that we should do that I haven't been doing in the lessons lately is closing our scanner. It is best practice to close your scanner. So the program's still going to run fine without it, but it is best practice just to put scnr.close to close up that scanner. Essentially, Java's garbage collection just doesn't clean up scanner objects. So that's where scanner.close comes in. It just closes up that scanner for us. So let's run this again one last time, and let's put 100 this time. So we're going to get a random number anywhere between 1 and 100. Guess a number between 1 and 100. 50 is too low, 75 is too high. Let's try 63. 63 is right. And then the program execution continues with whatever's after the while loop with the try catch block inside of it. We're looking at reading and writing to files in Java. There's a lot of ways to do this. We're going to look at one of the easiest and most popular ways to do it using a buffered writer and buffered reader. Let's go ahead and make our buffered writer. We'll say buffered writer equals new buffered writer, new file writer. And then in brackets, we're going to put the name of the file in quotation marks. Let's just write to output file.txt. And we'll need a capital W on this file writer. So what's happening here is we're making an object called a buffer writer that's just going to do the writing for us. We've named it writer. And then we're just passing that buffered writer a file called output_file.txt. If that file doesn't already exist on our computer in the directory that Java's going to look in, then this file writer object is just going to make one for us. So it'll create output_file.txt if it doesn't already exist in the directory that it's looking in. And once we actually make this file, then we'll go take a look at which directory Java does automatically put it in. Right now we have a bunch of errors in here as well, all underlined in red, because in order to use buffered writer and file writer, we have to import them. So we could write our import statements up here. I'm just going to hit Control-Shift-O, which is just going to import everything that Java thinks that I need. And there's a couple other small things we need to do before we can use this. When we do input and output in Java, then there's a decent chance of our program throwing an input-output exception, which is just when something goes wrong with the input or output. And so we need to account for that in some way. We could write up here, throws IO exception, and then import IO exception. That will work, but it's not exactly the best way to handle it. And generally, it's better to catch exceptions instead of throwing them. Throwing them pretty much just says, I don't care about this exception, let's just get rid of it, discard it. Catching them is better practice, so we're going to catch this. We're going to put our buffered writer declaration inside of a try. So we'll just copy and paste this. or sorry, cut and paste, get rid of it, put it inside the try. And then we're gonna hit catch exception E. And we'll just print out the stack trace for E. And now let's use our buffered writer. Just to test it out right away, let's say writer dot write. This text will be written to file. And then we need to close this writer as soon as we're done with it. We'll say writer dot close. And now we can run this and go check out our new file that Java's written to. So we called it output file.txt. There we go. And it says this text will be written to file. And we're going to read this same file in. But before we do that, let's tidy up our program a little bit. Right now we have all this inside of the main method. Let's make a separate method real quick. Public static void write file. And we're just going to copy and paste this code into there. So it's inside of write file. And then from the main method, we'll just call write file right away. So we could run this right now and it would do the exact same thing as it did last time, just write to this text file here. It just looks a lot cleaner now. And let's also write a new method for reading our file in. Let's say a public static string read file. So write file isn't going to return anything. That's why we have return type void, but public static string read file is going to return a string. And that's just going to be the string that we read in from the file. Let's say string user info equals empty. And at the end of the method, we'll return a string. Let's say return user info. So we're just going to make our writer write some user info to the file, and then the read file is going to read that user info in and store it in a string. In write file, we used a buffered writer. In read file, we're going to use a buffered reader. And again, we're going to declare it inside of a try catch block. Catch exception E again. And just print the stack trace. In try, we'll make buffered reader equals new buffered reader new file reader, and we'll pass it our output file.txt. So it's just going to read in that file that we made. And again, I'm just going to hit Control-Shift-O to import all this stuff that we need. Put a space in here. It's saying that file reader can't be resolved to a type. It didn't import it for some reason. I'll just hit Control-Shift-O again, see if it does. There we go. Now it's imported, and we're just going to close this right away too before we forget. Let's say reader.close. And now let's go up to our write file and let's write the info that we're going to send into that file that we're making. Let's just say username cool guy 37 new line. \n just puts a new line into our string. So right now this is going to write out username cool guy 37, and then on the next line it's going to write out level 18, and then \n again. So now on the next line it's going to write XP 1550, and we'll add another new line on the end there just in case we write anything else after. And we'll take a look at what this looks like in a second. We'll write it to a file. But before we do that, let's just finish our read file method. Let's say string current line, and then we'll say while current line equals reader dot read line does not equal null. And I'll explain this in a sec. We're just gonna put our code in here. Let's say user info plus equals current line, and then we'll put a new line into user info plus equals new line character. So we have this string current line, and for every pass of the while loop, reader is going to read a line and store it in current line. And as long as the results of that, as long as the current line does not equal null, null just being empty, as long as it does not equal null, then our user info string is going to add the current line into it. And then it's going to add a new line character. Right now, let's just run the program as is. We haven't even called our method read file yet, but let's just see what our file looks like with this new user info in there. Let's save and run the program. And then I'll go find user info again. No, what was it called? It was called output file. Output file. So here's output file. I'll make this a little bit bigger. We have username coolguy37, level 18, XP 1550. So every time we put \n, then it just jumped to the next line and kept writing. And now let's call read file. Let's say string user info equals read file. So whatever is returned by read file, which is going to be our string, is going to be stored inside of this new variable user info. And then we'll just print out user info, system.out.println user info. Let's run this and see what we get. We get username coolguy37, level 18, XP 1550. I missed some spaces in here. It looks a little bit messy. That's all right. We'll just put one in here and before coolguy37, run it again. Username coolguy37, level 18, XP 1550. And let's take a look at where we put the new line in here. That's inside of our read file method. Inside of the while loop, we put the new line in. We might think that it would work fine without it, but what actually happens is everything just gets read into the same line because buffered reader.readLine doesn't take in new line characters. So even though we had these new line characters, these \n's inside of our file, readLine just takes in the line of text. It ignores the new line character. It just reads in coolguy37, and when it sees new line, then it says, okay, I've done my job. I've grabbed coolguy37. It doesn't actually grab the new line character. So without putting this new line inside of our read file, what we would get is everything just printed all to the same line. So we get username coolguy37, level 18, XP, all on the same line. So that's why we need this extra new line character in here. This new file that we made, by the way, the output file.txt, just gets saved to the project folder. So if we go find it, we say output file.txt. You might expect that Eclipse would save it inside of the source folder next to the file that we're working in, but it actually saves it in a project folder. So that's something to keep in mind, just in case you need to find that file for any reason. We're looking at switch statements. Let's start off with an example. Let's make an int to use inside of our statement. We'll say int a, and we won't even assign it a value yet. And then we're going to write switch a. So this switch statement that follows in the enclosing curly brackets, it's kind of like a switchboard, and it switches according to the value of a. In the case of a being 1, then we're going to write case 1 system.out.println. Let's just assign the user to a random team. Let's say you are on team blue. And let's put this on the next line just to keep it looking nice and neat. And on the next line, we're going to write break. So break just means that that's the end of the code that we want to execute in case 1, which is just when a is 1. So if a is 1, then this code executes and then it breaks out of here. And then we'll say case 2 system.out.println you are on team yellow. Break. And let's just copy these down. Let's go case 3 you are on team pink. Case 4 you are on team green. And then we're going to have a default case. We just write default, and that's if A is any value other than 1, 2, 3, or 4. Then we're just going to print out system.out.println you are on team orange. So if they don't get a value between 1 and 4, then they're going to be on team orange. And we don't necessarily need a break here because it's the last case in the switch statement. I like to put one anyways, and lots of other people do as well, just because every other case has a break with it. So I just like putting one for the default anyways. Now let's assign a value to A. Let's say int A equals int math.random times, let's say, times 6 plus 1. So this is going to give us a random number between 1 and 6. So let's run this and see what we get. Before we run it, let's just make another print statement so we can see what's happening. System.out.println A is plus the value of A. Now we'll just run this a bunch of times and see what's going to happen. So we get you are on team orange. That happened because A is 5, and if A is anything other than 1, 2, 3, or 4, then it enters into our default, which is your team orange. And then we get you are on team yellow because A was 2, so case 2 enters, and then it breaks out of here. And then we get you are on team orange because A is 5, and you are on team pink because A is 3. And let's see what happens if we take one of these breaks out of here. Let's take 2 out just so we can make sure it's actually going to happen and we don't have to run this 5 more times. So for case 2 and case 3, we took out the break statements. And I'm going to run this till we get case 2 or 3. There we go. So we got A is 2, and now it said you are on team pink and you are on team green. So because there was no break in here after you are on team pink, then the code just keeps going through and it executes case 4 as well. So that's why we get you are on team pink and you are on team green. So that's why we need our break statements in here. So quick little recap, all the switch statement does is it enters these different cases based on the value of the variable that you pass to it. In this case, the variable was A, so it just entered these different cases according to the value of A. Java challenge number 1. We're going to make a database of players in a game. And that's just going to be 3 separate arrays. We're going to have a players array, a player levels array, which will be an integer array, and an array for the player's XP levels, which will also be an integer array. And then we're going to have a menu with 3 options. We're going to have enter new player, delete player, and view all players. And the program is going to auto-save every time a new player is entered or deleted, and auto-load every time the program starts up. So let's pop all of this out of the main method just to keep everything looking nice and clean. And let's get started in the main method. Let's make our arrays in here, and then we'll pass them to our other methods as needed. We'll say string array players equals new string array. Let's give it 100 elements. And int array player levels equals new int array 100 elements again. Int array player XPs equals new int array 100 elements. And let's just make int num players to keep track of the number of players that are entered into the array at any given time. And let's say num players, and then we're going to load in our file. We don't actually have the file made to load in yet, but we'll just write this in the main method for now. We'll say num players equals load player info, players, player levels, player XPs, and num players. So we're going to pass all of these into load player info. There's a few different ways that we could go about calling our methods and passing our variables around. Right now, as we have it, we're passing all of these into the method load player info. And load player info can make changes to these arrays. And the changes that are made inside of the method load player info will affect these arrays. Everything is going to work okay. But because integers in Java are primitive data types, if we make changes to num players inside of load player info, then this version of num players that's inside of the main method isn't actually going to change when we try and change it inside of load player info. We'll explain this a little bit more in detail when we actually write the load player info method. And if it doesn't make sense yet, then it'll start to make sense as soon as we start writing load player info. Right now from our main, let's include the other method that we're going to call from here. Let's say launch program, and then we're just going to pass it everything again. It gets players, player levels, player XPs, and num players. And we don't need to include the num players equals launch program because launch program is the last method that we're going to call in the program. It's just going to handle everything else for us, so we don't need any value returned because it's the very last method. Now let's write our load player info method. Let's say public static int, because this is going to return an integer, which will get held in num players. Let's say public static int load player info. And then we have to tell load player info what it's going to be expecting. It's going to be expecting a string array players, a int array player levels, and int array player XPs, and an int num players. And going back to what I was talking about before with num players here, what happens inside of this method isn't going to affect the value of num players outside of the method. When arrays get passed into a method, then Java just sends the reference to those objects. So it's just sending a reference to the string array players, the int array player levels, and the int array player XPs. And so we can alter those arrays inside of our method. But for primitive data types like integers, then Java is actually just going to send the value, which is 0. So it's passing by value, it's passing the 0 into this new num players that's going to exist inside of our method here. And if we make changes to num players inside of this method, then it's not going to affect this original num players. So what we have to do if we want this original version to be updated is we say num players equals load player info, and whatever value is returned by load player info, that's what's going to get stored inside of num players. And we know it's going to be an integer that's returned because that's what we've declared as the return type for the method. So then inside of the method, we just have to say return num players. And now that's the value that's going to get returned by the method, which is going to be stored inside of num players. So num players will get updated. Now let's go ahead and write our load player info method. We're going to add a bit more onto here after, but for now we're just going to do a simple try catch block with our buffered reader inside of it. If there's an error, let's just print the stack trace. And then let's say try buffered reader equals new buffered reader, new file reader. And for now, let's just write players info.txt in here. We're going to do this a little bit differently after. For now, we're just sticking with the same way that we did it in our Java file input and output tutorial. For now, let's just leave it as is. And let's remember to close it right away. Let's say reader.close. And then let's read in the info from our imaginary file that doesn't exist right now, but that we're going to write after. Let's say num players equals integer dot parse int reader dot read line. So in the file that we're going to write, that will hold the player's info. Then the very top line of it is going to be the line that indicates the number of players saved in the file. Reader.readLine returns a string. We want an integer value because the value is being stored inside of num players. So we just have to convert this string that's returned from readLine into an integer. And for that, we just use integer.parseInt, which just converts it for us. Right now we're getting an error message, just that file reader hasn't been imported yet. Let's just say Control-Shift-O, and that'll bring in for us what we need. Now let's make a for loop that's going to read in the rest of the data in the file. Let's just say for int I equals 0 while I is less than num players. And we're going to know the value of num players because it gets read in on the very first line of the file. So let's say while I is less than num players, I plus plus. And for the rest of the file, let's just have it look something like this. So the first line was num players, so say there's 15 players saved. Then on the next line, we'll start with the player username for the first player, so say user 97. And then the next line will be their player level, so that'd be 15 or whatever we want it to be, and then their player XP on the next line. So in our for loop, we've read in already before the for loop started num players. Inside of the for loop, we're going to read in these three values. Let's say players I equals reader dot read line. Player levels I equals, and this time we're going to have to convert the value into an integer again, because remember reader.readLine is going to return a string and player levels is an integer array. And we're going to do the same thing for player XPs. We'll just copy and paste that down. We have player XPs, integer.parseInt reader.readLine. And then the for loop will just continue through the rest of the file. So the second user's username would go right here, user 93, and then their level and XP and whatnot. And let's add one more thing onto this just to make our code a little bit more stable and robust. Let's say file player info file equals new file players underscore info.txt and Control-Shift-O just to bring in the file class. And the reason we're doing this is because the file class has a really handy method called exists. So it's going to check to make sure if that this file exists before trying to read it in. So we're not going to get a file not found error. So we can say if player info file dot exists, then execute all the following code. We'll take all this try catch, everything up to return num players, and put it inside of that if statement. And we can also just take away this player info.txt in quotations, and instead we can just write player info file in here. And that's it for our load player info method. Now let's move on to the other method we had, which was launch program. And inside of launch program, we're going to have a ton of subroutines, just little methods performing tasks for us, because the bulk of our program is going to happen here inside of launch program. And the reason that we put this in the main is just to keep the main looking nice and tidy, because it's not good practice to have a ton of code in our main method. So a launch program is going to handle most of our program. Let's say public static void launch program. And launch program, I believe, took in the same parameters as load player info. I'll double check. Yeah, we have all the same parameters in here. So we'll just copy and paste those into launch program. Inside of launch program, we're pretty much just going to have a while loop that handles the execution of our program. Let's say while not done, it will make a Boolean done. Boolean done equals false. In our menu, we'll just include a stop option that will end the program and turn Boolean done into true. Let's say while not done, and then we're going to put our subroutines in here. Let's say display menu. And then after displaying the menu, we'll get the user choice from the menu. So we'll say user choice equals get menu choice or get user choice, or whatever you're feeling. And then let's say num players equals execute choice. And we are going to pass some parameters to these methods. Let's figure that out in a sec. First, let's make some objects that we know we're going to need inside of these methods. Let's say scanner scnr equals new scanner system.in. Control-Shift-O just to import the scanner class. And both of these are definitely going to need to use the scanner because they're taking in some user input. I've put num players equals execute choice here because I already know that inside of execute choice, num players is going to be changed. Inside of user choice, it's not going to be because user choice is literally just taking the menu choice. So all that we're going to need to pass to that is the scanner, and then that'll just return the integer that is the user's choice. Execute choice is going to need access to all of our arrays and num players. Let's just copy players, player levels, player XPs, num players. Just paste that into our method call for execute choice after scnr. And let's make user choice. Let's just say int user choice equals -1. We'll use -1 just to let us know that there's been an error. If the value of user choice is -1 anywhere other than right here, then something's gone wrong and the user hasn't been able to select their choice. Now let's write all of these subroutines. And if you're new to Java, you might be asking, why do we need subroutines for all of these? Why not just write all of it inside of one method? And the answer to that is that whenever possible in Java, we want each method to only be doing one task. It keeps our code cleaner, and it's a lot easier to debug and find errors if we don't put all of our code inside of one method. It's also a lot easier to follow along with the program execution. If someone else comes and takes a look at this, then right away they can just see, okay, from the main methods, our arrays are being made, num players is being made, and then the player info is loaded in, and then the program gets launched. And they can tell that just by looking at our main method without having to read through a few hundred lines of code in the main method. And then they can just jump to launch program and see what's happening in here pretty easily. There's just one main loop that just displays the menu, gets the user choice, and executes that user choice. And just keeps doing that as long as the program isn't done running, as long as the user hasn't entered whatever menu choice we'll have that will exit the program. So first up, let's write our display menu method. Public static void display menu. Void because this method isn't returning anything, it's just printing out the menu for us. We don't need any value returned. Let's say system.out.println, enter the number of your menu choice, then hit enter. System.out.println. And let's just copy that down because we're going to need a few more print statements. Let's say 1, enter a new player. 2, delete a player. And 3, view all players. And let's have one more. That'll just be our quit option. Let's say for end program. Next up, let's write get user choice, which just takes in the scanner and returns an integer that is the user's choice. Let's say public static int get user choice, which can expect a scanner scnr, and it will return choice. We'll just make choice inside of here. We'll say int choice equals -1, again, so that we know if there's an error if the user didn't get to select their choice. Inside of get user choice, we're just going to have a while loop that takes in the user input. Let's say while not valid, and then we'll just make boolean valid equals false. So as long as a valid entry hasn't been put into choice, then this while loop will just keep operating. Let's put a try catch inside of it. Try and then catch exception E, print the stack trace. Oops, not add suppressed, E dot print stack trace. And let's also just print a little message with the stack trace. System.out.println. That is not a whole number between 1 to 4. Try again. And let's make sure we clear the scanner in here as well. So scnr dot next line. Otherwise, whatever is stored inside of choice up here will still be stored in the buffer, so we'll just be stuck in an infinite loop. Let's say try choice equals scnr dot next int. And then if choice is greater than or equal to 1, and choice is less than or equal to 4, then set valid to true, and then clear out the scanner. Else, and then we'll just copy this print statement. So this else statement is only going to execute if a number did get entered, but that number was not between 1 and 4. If anything other than a whole number gets entered, then this catch is going to execute. But if a whole number does get entered, then no exception is going to get thrown, but we just want to make sure that the whole number was between 1 and 4. If it wasn't, then we just print out that is not a whole number between 1 and 4. And we won't have to flush out our buffer here in this else. The reason that we had to flush it inside of the catch is because if someone tries putting something into this that isn't an integer, say they try putting 20.5 into choice, then the exception gets thrown, so then catch is entered. But when catch is entered, then there's still 20.5 left in the buffer unless we manually clear it out with next line. Whereas if someone puts something like, say, 16 into choice, then choice is going to accept that, and so 16 isn't going to be in the buffer still. All that would be in the buffer is the enter character, which is okay because next we're just going to call next int again. So essentially, if it's a valid int that gets entered, then it will be stored in choice, so the buffer will be empty. But if it's not a valid int, then the value won't even get stored in choice, it'll just still be in the buffer. And so that's why we have to clear it out inside of our catch statement. And that's all we're going to need for our get user choice method. Now let's write execute choice, which is going to take in scanner, players, player levels, and pretty much everything we have so far. Let's just go copy the parameters from launch program. And then we're also going to need to add this scanner to this list of parameters when we write execute choice. Let's say public static int execute choice. And I'll say expect a scanner, name that scanner scnr, and expect the rest of this list of variables. And then we're going to make this method return an integer. Let's say return num players. And let's just use a switch statement. Let's say switch. And I'm realizing right now we're going to need one more parameter here because we haven't taken in choice into this method and we're trying to execute choice. So let's just go up to where we call execute choice, which is inside of launch program. And we'll just say also expect choice. We don't need to say int in there, just choice. I think we called it something else maybe. What do we say? User choice, yeah. So it's expecting user choice. So here we put int, let's say user choice. We'll name it the same thing just to keep things clear. Switch based off of the value of user choice. Let's say case 1. Case 1 was menu choice 1, which was enter a new player. So let's say enter player. And we'll deal with the parameters for this after. First, let's just finish up our switch statements. So we have enter player break. Just going to copy and paste that down. So we have case 1, enter player. Case 2 is delete player. Case 3 is view all players. And for case 4, that was ending the program. Let's just get rid of case 4 for now, actually. What I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to go up to, I think it was execute choice. No, launch program. I'll go up to launch program, and I'm just going to put in here if user choice does not equal 4, then we'll execute choice. Else done equals true. So if the user didn't put in 4 to end the program, then execute their choice. If they did put in 4, then done equals true. So this while loop will stop and the program's going to be done. Now let's go back down to our execute choice. I think that's all we need in here other than our parameters for these methods. Enter player would need this scanner plus the list of arrays and num players. Probably would have been quicker just to write them in, but I'm up here anyways. I'm just going to copy and paste that list in. So it's expecting scanner plus our arrays and num players. That should be all we need in there. And let's give the same to delete player. View all players won't need the scanner, but it will need everything else so that it can print out all the players, but we're not going to need input, so we can get rid of the scanner here. That's it for our execute choice method. Now let's make our 3 new methods: enter player, delete player, and view all players. Public static int create player, and it's going to take in our scanner and all of our arrays. Scanner scnr followed by everything else and num players as well. And while we're at it, let's just write out the declaration of our delete player and view all players methods. Let's say delete player, which will expect the exact same things as create player. We're going to need everything for it. And view all players is going to need everything except for the scanner, because there's not going to be any input in there. It's just outputting the player's details to the screen. So let's say view all players, and view all players can be void. Again, we're not returning anything, we're just printing out the player's info. And let's finish up our create player method. Let's say system.out.println enter the player's username. And then players num players will equal scnr dot next line. So if num players is at 0 and no one's been entered yet, then the 0th element in players will take on whatever value the user inputs to it. If num players was at 3, for example, then 0, 1, and 2 would all be filled. The 0th first and second element would all be filled. And so the third element, players 3, would take on the value that the user puts in. So numplayers is just keeping track of where we are in our array, how many players we've entered into the arrays. We'll say player levels num players equals, let's just start it out at 1. Since it's a new player, then we'll automatically make that be 1. We won't even let them input anything to it. And player XPs will start out at 0. So we'll say player XPs num players equals 0. And then we'll say num players plus plus return num players. And let's fill in delete player. Let's say system.out.println what is the username of the player you would like to delete. And then string player to delete equals scnr dot next line. And then we're going to find the index that that player is at. So we'll say int index to delete equals find index, which is a method that we'll write. We'll say find index, which is going to need player to delete players so that it can search through the players array. And it'll need num players so that it knows how many players are entered into that array so far. And before we get ahead of ourselves, then let's just write that find index method right away. I'll copy and paste these just so we can remember what exactly it's going to expect. So we want find index, which is going to return an int, public static int find index, which will expect a string player to delete, a string array players, and an int array num players. And we'll just have it return index to delete. And we'll just make that at the top of the method here, int index to delete. And if index to delete has a value of -1 when it gets returned, then that's how we'll know that find index didn't find the username that was passed to it, the string player to delete, that username doesn't exist anywhere in the array. So we'll say for int I equals 0, as long as I is less than num players, I plus plus. And we'll say if objects dot equals player to delete and players I. Objects dot equals just compares two strings for equality, because comparing strings using double equals is never a good idea in Java. Just because of the way that Java stores strings, sometimes this will work and sometimes it won't work. And so there's an awesome method called objects.equals that we can use instead. So we'll say if objects.equals, and then we pass it the two strings that we want to compare. And if those two strings are equal, then we'll say index to delete equals I. So this will search through every element in our array, and if it finds an element that equals the player2 deletes, then it'll just mark that index that that player is at with I, and get an error here for some reason. While I is less than num players, I think I told the method that num players is going to be an int array. Yeah, let's go int num players. So now index2delete will just get passed back up to wherever it was called from, which was our delete player method. And we'll say if index2delete does not equal -1. Remember, -1 just gets returned if find index couldn't find the index of that player. So we'll say delete, which is a method that we'll write, and we're gonna have to pass it index2delete players, player levels, player XP, and num players. So we'll delete the player, and then we'll say num players minus minus, because there's one less player now. And we'll just print a message saying that the delete was successful. We'll say system.out.println player successfully deleted. And then we'll say else system.out.println player could not be found. And then we'll return num players. And we just have a few methods to write now. We have our delete method that we have to write, and then we'll write a method to save our info to a .txt file. And our view all players, which is going to be really simple. It'll just go through a for loop, printing out all the values. So let's write delete, which is going to take in our arrays, and it'll also take in index2delete. So public static void delete int index2delete, and then all of our arrays and num players. And then we'll just clear the values inside of the arrays at our index2deletes, because we can't actually delete elements in an array, so we'll just clear them out. Let's say players index2delete equals blank. Player levels index2delete, let's just give it a value of -1. Player XP's index2delete will give a value of -1 as well. And if we just left our method at this, then we would just have an empty place in our array wherever that player got deleted from. So what we need to do is we need to shift all of the players that come after index2delete one position over to fill in that empty hole. So let's say for int I equals 0, 1 after the index2delete actually. So we'll do int I equals index2delete plus 1. As long as I is less than num players, I++. And now we're just shifting everything over 1. So we'll say players I minus 1 equals players I. And we'll do the same for our other two arrays. So player levels I minus 1 equals player levels I. Player XP's I minus 1 equals player XP's I. So we've just shifted over every element after index2delete so that we don't have that hole where the index2delete was. Now we need our view all players method that we started up here, public static void view all players. And this is literally just going to be a for loop. For int I equals 0 while I is less than num players I plus plus, and it's just going to print out the values for each of our players. System.out.println players I. I'll just copy and paste that down. And let's say player levels I. Let's just write something to indicate that this is the player level 2. We'll say level plus the value of the player's level, and then we'll go XP plus the value of the player's XP. And let's just add a new line at the end of that. Now, all that we're going to need is our autosave method. Let's call that from inside of execute choice. So we'll call it after enter player or delete player. We'll say autosave, or name yours whatever you want, something to do with saving the arrays. Autosave. And autosave is going to need all of our arrays, and that should be it, just the arrays plus num players. And it can just be a void method as well. We don't need any value returned from it. Public static void autosave. And I've just copied and pasted the values from one of our other methods for our arrays and num players to be passed into here. And we'll just make a buffered writer inside of a try catch loop. We'll say try buffered writer equals new buffered writer new file writer player info.txt. And if you don't know what's going on in here with our file writer and buffered writer, then I have another tutorial on that. I'll link to that in the description. And Control-Shift-O just to import the buffered writer class. And right away, before I forget, I'll just close that writer.close. And now we're writing out the file that we read in at the start of the program in autoload, I think it was called, load player info. So remember, the very first line of the file is where we put num players. So we have to put that on the very top. And then after num players, then we just wrote out a for loop that would print out the username, the player level, and the player XP for every player inside of our arrays. So the first line, we're just going to write num players, writer.write num players plus a new line. Because remember, read player info or load player info, whatever it was, load player info is just reading in line by line what we have inside of player info file, which is the players info.txt, and it's doing that using read line, which is going to take in an entire line. So that's why we have to include the new line at the end of every line that we're going to put in here. So writer.write num players plus new line. And then we'll write out a for loop that's going to print out everything else for us. For int I equals 0 as long as I is less than num players I plus plus writer.write players I plus a new line. And just copy and paste that down and do the same for our player levels and player XP. Player levels, player XPs. And in the catch, we'll just print out the stack trace. And that should be all we need. We'll see if this will run okay. I already see we have an error somewhere, actually. Enter player, for some reason, is giving us an error. The method enter player is undefined for the type Java level 1, so we haven't wrote enter player. It's telling us, might have got the name wrong or something. Yeah, we called it create player. Let's just go ahead and change this to enter player, see if that throws any new errors. No, that's all good. If this were a bigger program, then we would have been testing each of these methods as we went along before putting it all together. Because in a bigger, more complex program, it would be really hard to find the bugs if you just throw everything together like this. But because our program is pretty small, we only have like 250 lines of code, I think, 233. Because it's pretty small, if there are any errors in here, then it shouldn't be too hard to find. If you do have any errors in yours once you've written it out, if you've never debugged something before, then my advice is just to use a ton of print statements. Just fill your program with print statements everywhere, printing out the values of the variables that are getting messed up. And just use print statements everywhere to see where the program is going wrong. In any program bigger than this, even if it was a little bit more complex, then I would have been testing it all the way through, testing every method before putting it all together. And watch, now that I've said that, we'll probably run this and we'll get some errors, but let's see what happens. Enter the number of your menu choice, then hit enter. Let's start with entering a new player. Enter the player's username, let's say user96. And let's see if that player actually was entered into the program. Let's just say view all players. And nothing is happening when we say view all players. So either that player isn't getting entered into the program, or view all players just isn't executing right. So let's use some print statements to find out what's happening. First, let's just make sure that view all players is actually executing. Let's go ahead and find view all players. And let's just throw a print statement in here. System.out.println test. And let's put another one inside of our for loop. Let's say system.out.println test2. And it's possible we've done something wrong with num players, so the program might be thinking right now that there aren't any players, and that's why it's not printing anything out. So let's just hit system.out.println num players inside view all players is plus num players. Let's run this again and see what's going to get printed out. Let's say enter a new player, user96, view all players. And there we go, num players is 0 inside of view all players, but it should be 1 because we've entered in a player. So let's go ahead and find where num players is going off. Maybe we didn't increment it at the end of enter player. So we have public static int enter player. We did increment num players and then we returned it. Let's print out the value of num players at the end of enter player. Let's say enter player and then num players. And then let's just go to wherever this is getting returned to, which I think is execute choice. And there's our mistake right away. We've said enter player here. What we should have said is num players equals enter player. And same with delete player, made the same mistake. Let's say num players equals delete player. And I'll run this again and then we'll go through and get rid of those print statements that we've put everywhere. Enter a new player, user96. So in enter player, the value of num players is 1. That's all good, that checks out. Let's say view all players. Now we get these test print statements that we had, and then we get the player printed out. We get user96, level 1, XP 0. So let's go through and get rid of all those print statements that we just threw in. I think we had them inside of enter player and there was somewhere else inside of view all players is where we put the other ones. So let's run this again, make sure everything else is working. Enter a player, user96, enter the number of your menu choice. Let's view all players, and it gives us the correct user96, level 1, XP 0. Let's add a few more just to make sure nothing's gonna get messed up in here. Let's say John 1, enter new player, Jack 2, enter new player, Jerry 3, and let's see if it'll print out all these players. We got user 96, then we have John 1, Jack 2, Jerry 3. Let's try and delete one of them now. Let's delete one of the ones in the middle. Let's delete Jack 2. Delete player. What is the name of the player you would like to delete? Just to test out our delete method first, let's put the name of a player that doesn't exist in here. Let's say James 6. Player could not be found, and everything's okay. The program doesn't crash or anything. Let's say delete a player. What is the username? And this time let's put the name of the actual player, Jack 2. Player successfully deleted. Let's see if it actually deleted it. View all players. And Jack 2 is gone, and the other users just filled in that empty hole inside of our arrays, so that's all good. Let's end the program and then start it up and see if our file actually got saved. Let's hit 4 to end the program. And I can't remember, I thought we put in a print statement for when we hit 4, but it's possible we didn't. Maybe the program's just ending before our print statement even executes. Let's say done. I think that was the value of the variable that we changed. So if user choice does not equal 4, else done equals true. So no, we didn't actually print out any message. Let's just say system.out.println, you have ended the program. Now let's run this again and see if our file actually loads in from last time. Let's say view all players right away, and nothing happens. Our file isn't loading in. First off, let's go find the file on the computer. Let's say players_info.txt. View red results, no. Players_info. It's possible the file just doesn't exist right now. My computer's not finding it. So this file never actually got created. Let's find players info. There it is in load player info. That's the only place it exists right now, so clearly we've done something wrong inside of the autosave method. Buffered writer, player info. I missed the S in players info. There we go. So let's run this again. Let's just re-enter some users. Enter the player's username, John 1, Jack 2, Jerry 3, James 4. And I didn't hit enter a new player before I typed in James 4, but our program isn't crashing. It just says that's not a whole number. Try again. Let's say 1, James 4. Let's view these, make sure they got entered. So John 1, Jack 2, Jerry 3, James 4. And let's end the program. You have ended the program. Let's start it up again and see if these load in this time. View all players. We have John 1, Jack 2, Jerry 3, and James 4. So everything's working now. We can enter a player, we can delete a player, we can view all the players, we can end the program. And when it starts up, then it's automatically loading those players in, and it's automatically saving them every time we run enter player or delete player.